Hello, this is Michael Hexter. Welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, this episode I'm calling Ukraine Invasion Exposes Gaps in Political Theory, Geopolitics for Small slash Medium Sized Nations. So, this sounds like a topic that has an academic sound or intellectual kind of sound when I talk about political theory and geopolitics and so forth and so on. But what I'm really focusing on is that we've been taken by surprise in a way by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also it's created shifts in alliances and our understanding of politics, understanding of geopolitics, and even though it really shouldn't have, but it has. And so and we see kind of either a sharpening of the formation of blocks, blocks, BLOCS, or the formation maybe of new blocks, realignment, and this has a lot to do with how these are things that we haven't really thought about in a number of years. And also, I think the size of nations matters in a way that we really haven't thought about very carefully in big, large social theory and political theory discussions. And even though that sounds like the preoccupation of only a few egg-headed people or something like that, that actually filters down into politics and into arguments about politics that are very visceral and emotional. For instance, we have arguments about who's a fascist, and currently in this conflict, or who's worse. In other words, using the word fascist as a stand-in for who is worse. And so the invasion, creates or changes some people's view, at least, of the Russian regime and of Putin, and it also changes our view of what are the situations of the countries at the borders of any superpower, and that includes of the U.S. So we've kind of are thinking about politics as reified, or not the lefts, let's say the left's thinking about politics as reified around the U.S. basically as being the dominant superpower and hegemon in the world. And so everything has been translated into the specific historical and geographical characteristics of the U.S. and its various wars, its various imperialist adventures, so forth and so on, over the last 60, 70 years. And that thinking has created a sort of this one-off sense of it all revolves around U.S. The progression of the U.S. imperial project. And we have, with Russia then coming into the picture, or re-emerging, or as a imperial power, or at least our consciousness of it as an imperial power is being brought to the top of mind by Putin's invasion. Then we have a sense of, there's something more general to be understood about this, basically either superpowers or mega powers, and then smaller nations. We can call them medium-sized. We can call them small. And how they are affected by these superpowers or these mega powers, let's say. And so we can think of the world as being divided up into these kind of mega powers that are like India, China, Russia, the United States. and that's pretty much it. And maybe Japan, but not actually not really in terms of their military. They're dependent on the U.S. For their military position in East Asia. So anyway, but the those in those nations, approximately a third of the population of the world, maybe a little over a third, lives in those nations, mostly in India and China. And India is not such a mega power, and in a way, it might be excluded from this group in some way or another. So, but because of its, it doesn't really dominate the subcontinent in the same way that Russia dominates its periphery, its near periphery, or the United States dominates Latin America to some degree. Again, with exceptions, like Cuba is independent of the U.S. And Venezuela is independent, and we have other nations that in the sort of the pink tide in Latin America that have started to steer courses or have rediscovered a course that is independent of the U.S. dominance of that continent. But anyway, thinking about these smaller countries, especially on the periphery of mega powers and or superpowers, mega powers, creates the thought that, like, well, wait a minute, these countries are smaller and they can never have the same power as a Russia or a United States, and so they, in order to be free, they need to either triangulate between superpowers, and that's what we see in some sense Ukraine doing, and other nations within Eastern Europe and also just Europe more generally, and or also banding together, attempting to band together with other smaller powers, and this points out to sort of this kind of gap between we can't really expect a small nation to cover all of its security needs in a world where there are superpowers and megapowers in it. So it needs to either ally itself with one of the superpowers or create a bloc. And this is where, and I will do probably another video about this, the lack of the non-aligned movement in a way, which collapsed in the 1990s, that the non-aligned movement, which centered on Yugoslavia was the leading, the inspiration and the leader of the non-aligned movement when it was, independent socialist, independent communist socialist. They had a third way kind of socialism going in Yugoslavia since the 1940s that collapsed in the 1990s, and so anyway, that but the non-aligned movement was a broader movement that attempted to be independent of both the Soviet bloc and also the American-led NATO alliance, and so anyway, that that kind of a bloc is something that you could also think is a small, medium-sized nation effort to fill in these gaps in geopolitical strength that they have. In other words, that they can't, all their security needs, all their diplomatic needs can't be covered by their own foreign affairs ministry, defense ministry. They need to have some kind of reciprocal relationships or a alliance with a big bully that is looking out for them. And so, and this is something that I think has been lacking in, even though this seems entirely commonsensical, it has been lacking in our understanding of, at least in the circles that I have, uh, you know, uh, been politically active in, where we've been focusing on disarmament and on liberation, national liberation, but we haven't. It's mostly been focused on the U.S. being the the single center of oppression in the world, and while it is a very substantial center of that, it is not the only one, and so having this general idea about, well, if it's a smaller country, it needs to come up with these other resources. So anyway, the this makes sense that it makes sense then that that a smaller country, also economically. So we have economic theories that really don't take into account the size of a national economy in much detail. It can come some in theories of trade. It comes up in some ways in terms of like comparative advantage, and sort of if certain economies are dominated or export driven, or they're hyper specialized or over specialized in terms of their one sector or another. And you would expect that, but the size of the country really, you wouldn't expect a country of 3, 4, 5 million people, or even 20 million people, to have a full spectrum of all kinds of industries within its borders. It would need to be trading for some basic machinery or basic, basic consumer goods with other countries, and might have long supply chains that extend outside that country, more so than a big country would have. Now, as it happens, almost all countries now have enormous, perhaps with the exception of China, have enormous long supply chains that extend across the globe, across oceans, and so that distinction is maybe less clear. But anyway, you still would think that even more so, that a country of 2 million or 5 million is going to be even more dependent on a block, of being part of a block, and also having an economy that is tied in with other economies, and so this is where, even though I'm very, very critical of the way the European Union has run a lot of its economic projects, including the euro, which is a very flawed system, and the way that the European Central Bank administers it, it's deflationary and austerian, and pro financial sector, and not pro people. So it is, but nevertheless, that project of having some kind of trading block, it makes much sense for small and medium-sized countries to be part of something like that. The rules should be different than they are in the EU. Its functioning should be different, but that project is something that, and this is something that Timothy Snyder, almost recommends in a way in his discussions of nationhood in Europe, that where he doubts that actually the nations of Europe have ever been traditional nation states. They've either been empires, or now they're becoming this sort of block of European sort of a super state or whatever, or of all European countries, or most European countries, integrated together in some form or another. So anyway, so this also, for people again on the left who are focusing on national liberation and against imperialism, you would be looking and more closely at the size of a country and more sympathetic to its needs for protection from bullies and from and that protection might come from the other superpower, or it might come from one of these blocks. And you would, in the case of Eastern Europe, close to the border of Russia, those people are looking to either the rest of Europe or to the United States plus the rest of Europe to push back and to create the military the military shield in some way or another for them to be freer. And that's really where, and we see this in the evolution of Western Europe after World War II. I mean, the Western part of Europe did and has flourished under the umbrella, the nuclear umbrella, the military umbrella of mostly the United States, also plus NATO. And it's been a place that has enjoyed, in my opinion, the highest standards of living, with some exceptions and some, but they're generally the standard of living has been very high in many countries of at least prior to 2008, in many countries of Europe. And also the system, at least, it shows a way in which even after 2008, if the faults of the ECB and the austerity ideology that the ECB has imposed on countries in that bloc, there are fixes for that in a way that allow that project to still have some potential to keep providing that high standard of living, fairly, certainly at a lower ecological damage than the North American style of living. Though I think both North America and most of Europe, but basically all of Europe, need to radically decarbonize their economies, and particularly with the Ukraine invasion being the latest wake-up call for that to happen among many wake-up calls. So anyway, so I just wanted to put that out there, that thinking about big and small, and then adjusting our political discourse to understand large powers, medium-sized powers, small powers, and how they can work together. And medium-sized could also bully small, so it's not as though it's all just the big ones. So a country like France could bully Luxembourg or something, or Germany might bully the Netherlands or something, or Denmark, for instance. So that and it has some sense. Germany has been a quasi mega power, certainly economically, within Europe. So though less militarily. So anyway, so there's all kinds of needs to balance power between nations that have different sizes. And so that balancing act requires more thought. So anyway, so I'm putting this out there. I will return to this topic at a later time, but the Ukraine invasion makes this more obvious. So anyway, so please share your thoughts and comments in the comments below. If you like this video, please like, and also please subscribe to Politics 2100 if you're enjoying the content, or if you're getting something out of it. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.